Night was coming at last. Tired, he squatted on a rock which was as large and round as a millstone. "I shall go no further," he murmured. "Here on this rock I shall set up my bulwark and do battle." The darkness flowed abruptly down from the sky, rose up from the soil, covered the earth, and with the darkness came the frost. His teeth chattering, he wrapped himself in his white robe, curled up into a ball, and closed his eyes. But as he closed them, he grew frightened. He recalled the crows, heard the famished jackals begin to howl on every side, felt the desert prowling around him like a wild beast. Afraid, he reopened his eyes. The sky had filled with stars, and he felt comforted. "The seraphim have come out to keep me company," he said to himself. "They are the six-winged lights which sing psalms around God's throne, but they are far away, so very far away that we cannot hear them." His mind illuminated by starlight, he forgot his hunger and cold. He too was a living thing, an ephemeral beacon in the darkness. He too sang hymns to God. His soul was a small pharos, the humble, poorly dressed sister of the angels. Thinking of his high extraction, he took heart, saw his soul standing together with the angels around God's throne, and then, peacefully and without fear, he closed his eyes and slept. He awoke. He lifted his face toward the east and saw the sun, a terrible blast furnace rising above the sand. "That is God's face," he reflected, putting his palm over his eyes so that he would not be dazzled. "Lord," he whispered, "I am a grain of sand. Can you see me in this desert? I am a grain of sand which talks and breathes and loves you. Loves you and calls you Father. I possess no weapon but love. With that I have come to do battle. Help me." He rose. With his reed he inscribed a circle around the rock where he had slept. "I shall not leave this threshing floor," he said loudly, so that the invisible forces which were lying in wait for him could hear. "I shall not leave this threshing floor unless I hear God's voice. But I must hear it clearly. I won't be satisfied with the usual unsteady hum or twittering or thunder. I want him to speak to me clearly, with human words, and to tell me what he desires from me and what I must do. Only then will I get up and leave this threshing floor to return to men. If that is his command, or to die, if that is his will, I'll do whatever he wishes, but I must know what it is, in God's name." He knelt on the rock with his face toward the sun, toward the great desert. He closed his eyes, remasked those of his thoughts which had lingered at Nazareth, Magdala, Capernaum, Jacob's well, and the river Jordan, and began to put them in battle array. He was preparing for war. With his neck tensed and his eyelids closed, he sank with himself. He heard the roar of water, the rustling of reeds, the lamentations of men. From the river Jordan came wave after wave of cries, terror, and far-away visionary hopes. First to stand up in his mind were the 3 long nights he had spent on the rock with the wild ascetic. In full armor, they rushed to the desert to enter the war at his side. The first night jumped down on top of him like a monstrous locust with cruel wheat-yellow eyes and wings, breath like the Dead Sea, and strange green letters on its abdomen. It clung to him. Its wings began furiously to rend the air. Jesus cried out and turned. The Baptist was standing next to him with his bony arm pointing in the heavy darkness towards Jerusalem. "Look. What do you see?" "Nothing." "Nothing? In front of you is holy Jerusalem, the whore. Don't you see her? She sits and giggles on the Roman's fat knees. The Lord cries, I do not want her. Is this my wife? I do not want her. I too, like a dog at the Lord's feet, bark. I do not want her. I walk around her towers and walls and bark at her. Whore, whore. She has 4 great fortress gates. At the first sits hunger, at the next fear, at the third injustice, and at the fourth, the number 1, infamy. I enter, go up and down her streets. I approach her inhabitants and examine them. Regard their faces. 3 are heavy, fat, over-satiated. 3,000 emaciated from hunger. When does a world disappear? When 3 masters overeat and a people of 3,000 starves to death. Look at their faces once more. Fear sits on all of them. Their nostrils quiver. They scent the day of the Lord. Regard the woman. Even the most honest glances secretly at her slave, licks her chops, and nods to them. Come. I have unroofed their palaces. Look. The king holds his brother's wife on his knees and caresses her nakedness. What do the Holy Scriptures say? He who looks at the nakedness of his brother's wife, death. It is not he, the incestuous king, who will be killed, but I, the ascetic. Why? Because the day of the Lord has come. The whole of that first night Jesus sat at the Baptist's feet and watched hunger, fear, injustice, and infamy go in and out of Jerusalem's 4 open gates. Over the holy prostitute, the clouds were gathering, full of anger and hail. The second night the Baptist once more stretched forth his reed-like hand, and with a thrust pushed through time and space. Listen. What do you hear? Nothing. Nothing. Don't you hear the iniquity? The bitch who has climbed shamelessly up to heaven and is barking at the Lord's door? Haven't you been through Jerusalem? Haven't you seen the yelping priests, high priests, scribes, and Pharisees who surround the temple? But God endures the earth's impudence no longer. He has risen. He is tramping down the mountainsides and coming. In front of him is anger. Behind him are heaven's 3 bitches. Fire, leprosy, and madness. Where is the temple with the proud gold-inlaid columns which supported it and proclaimed, Eternal, eternal, eternal? Ashes the temple, ashes the priests, high priests, scribes and Pharisees, ashes their holy amulets, their silken cassocks and golden rings. Ashes, ashes, ashes. Where is Jerusalem? I hold a lighted lantern. I search in the mountains in the Lord's darkness. I shout, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Deserted, completely forsaken. Not even a crow answers. The crows have eaten and left. I wade knee-deep in the skulls and bones. Tears come to my eyes, but I push the bones away and banish them. I laugh, bend down, and choose the longest one, make a flute and hymn the glory of the Lord. The whole of the second night the Baptists laughed, stood in God's darkness, and admired fire, leprosy, and madness. Jesus grasped the prophet's knees. Cannot salvation come to the world by means of love, he asked? By means of love, joy, mercy? The Baptist, without even turning to look at him, replied, Haven't you ever read the Scriptures? The Savior crushes our loins, breaks our teeth, hurls fire and scorches the fields, all in order to sow. And he uproots the thorns, stinkweeds, and nettles. How can you wipe out falsehood, infamy, and injustice from the world if you do not eradicate the liars, the unjust, the wicked? The earth must be cleansed. Don't pity it. It must be cleansed, made ready for the planting of new seed. The second night passed. Jesus did not speak. He was awaiting the third night. Perhaps the prophet's voice would sweeten. The third night the Baptist twisted and turned upon the rock uneasy. Without laughing, without talking, he examined Jesus with anguish, searched his arms, hands, shoulders, and knees, then shook his head and remained quiet, sniffing the air. Illuminated by the starlight, his eyes stood out, glistening, sometimes green, sometimes yellow, and sweat mingled with blood ran from his sunk, sun-baked forehead. Finally, at daybreak, when the white dawn fell upon them, he took Jesus' hand, looked into his eyes, and frowned. When I first saw you emerge from the reeds by the Jordan and come directly toward me, he said, my heart bounded like a young calf. Can you think how Samuel's heart leaped up when he first saw the red-haired, beardless shepherd David? That is how my heart leaped. But the heart is flesh, and loves the flesh, and I have no faith in it. Last night I examined you, smelled you as though seeing you for the first time, but I could not find peace. I looked at your hands. They were not the hands of a woodchopper of a Savior. Too soft, too merciful. How could they swing the axe? I looked at your eyes. They were not a Savior's eyes. Too full of sympathy. I got up and sighed. Lord, I murmured, Your days are dark and oblique. You are capable of sending a white dove to burn up the world and turn it into ashes. We watch the heavens expecting a thunderbolt, an eagle or a crow, and you give us a white dove. What use is there of questioning, of resisting? Do what you like. He spread out his arms and hugged Jesus, kissed him on his right shoulder, then on his left. "If you are the one I've been waiting for," he said, "you have not come in the form I imagined you would. Was it all for nothing, then, that I carried the axe and placed it at the root of the tree? Or can love also wield an axe?" He reflected for a moment. "I cannot judge," he murmured finally. "I shall die without seeing the result. It does not matter. That's my lot, a hard one, and I like it." He squeezed Jesus' hand. "Go, and good luck. Go talk with God in the desert, but come back quickly so that the world will not remain all alone." Jesus opened his eyes. The river Jordan, the Baptists, and the baptized, the camels, and the lamentations of the people all flared up in the air and were snuffed out. The desert now stretched before him. Jesus opened his eyes. The river Jordan, the Baptists, and the baptized, the camels, and the lamentations of the people all flared up in the air and were snuffed out. The desert now stretched before him. The sun had risen high and was burning. The stones seemed like loaves of bread. He felt his insides being mowed down by hunger. "I'm hungry," he murmured, looking at the stones. "I'm hungry." He remembered the bread which the old Samaritan woman had presented them. How delicious it had been, sweet like honey. He remembered the honey. Split olives and dates he was treated to whenever he passed through a village, and the holy supper they had when kneeling on the shore of Lake Gennesaret. They removed the grill, with its row of sweet-smelling fish, from the andirons, and afterward the figs, grapes, and pomegranates came to his mind, agitating him still further. His throat was dry and parched from thirst. How many rivers flowed in the world? All these waters, which bounded from rock to rock, rolled from one end of the land of Israel to the other, ran into the Dead Sea, and disappeared. And he had not even a drop to drink. He thought of these waters, and his thirst increased. He felt dizzy, his eyes fluttered. Two cunning devils in the shape of young rabbits emerged from the burning sand, stood up on their hind legs, and danced. They turned, saw the eremite, screamed happily, and began to hop toward him. They climbed onto his knees and jumped to his shoulders. One was cool like water, the other warm and fragrant like bread. But as he longingly put out his hands to grasp them, with a single bound they vanished into the air. He closed his eyes and recollected the thoughts which hunger and thirst had dispersed. God came to his mind. He was neither hungry nor thirsty any more. He reflected on the salvation of the Word. Ah, if the day of the Lord could only come with love! Was not God omnipotent? Why couldn't he perform a miracle and by touching men's hearts make them blossom? Look how each year at the Passover bare stems, meadows, and thorns opened up at his touch. If only one day men could awake to find their deepest selves in bloom. He smiled. In his thoughts the world had flowered. The incestuous king was baptized, his soul cleansed. He had sent away his sister-in-law Herodias, and he had returned to her husband, and she had returned to her husband. The high priest and noblemen had opened their larders and coffers, distributing their goods to the poor, and the poor in their turn breathed freely once more and banished hate, jealousy, and fear from their hearts. Jesus looked at his hands. The axe, which the forerunner had surrendered to him, had blossomed. A flowering almond branch was now in his palm. The day concluded with the feeling of relief. He lay down on the rock and fell asleep. All night long in his sleep he heard water running, small rabbits dancing, a strange rustling, and two damp nostrils examining him. It seemed to him that toward midnight a hungry jackal came up and smelled him. Was this a carcass or wasn't it? The beast stood for a moment unable to make up its mind, and Jesus, in his sleep, pitied it. He wanted to open his breast and give it food, but restrained himself. He was keeping his flesh for men. He woke up before dawn. A network of large stars covered the sky. The air was fluffy and blue. At this hour, he reflected, the cocks awake, the villages are roused, men open their eyes and look through the skylight at the radiance which has come once more. The infants awake in their turn. The bowling begins, and the mothers approach, holding forth their full breasts. For an instant the world undulated over the desert with its men and houses, and cocks and infants and mothers, all made from the morning frost and breeze. But the sun would now rise and swallow them up. The eremite's heart skipped a beat. If only I could make the frost everlasting, he thought. But God's mind is an abyss, his love a terrifying precipice. He plants a world, destroys it just as it is about to give fruit, and then plants another. He recalled the Baptist's words. Who knows, perhaps love carries an axe, and shuddered. He looked at the desert. Ferociously red, it swayed under the sun, which had risen angrily, zoned by a storm. The wind blew. The smell of pitch and sulfur came to his nostrils. He thought of Sodom and Gomorrah. Palaces, theaters, taverns, prostitutes plunged in the tar. Abraham had shouted, Have mercy, Lord, do not burn them. Are you not good? Take pity, therefore, on your creatures. And God had answered him, I am just. I shall burn them all. Was this then God's way? If so, it was a great impudence for the heart. that clot of soft mud, to stand up and shout, "Stop!" What is our duty? He asked himself. It is to look down, to find God's tracks in the soil and follow them. I look down, I clearly see God's imprint on Sodom and Gomorrah. The entire Dead Sea is God's imprint. He trod, and places, palaces, theaters, taverns, brothels, the whole of Sodom and Gomorrah, were engulfed. He will tread once more, and once more the earth, kings, high priests, Pharisees, Sadducees, all will sink to the bottom. Without realizing it, he began to shout. His mind was wild with fury. Forgetting that his knees were unable to support him, he tried to rise, to set out on God's trail, but he collapsed supine onto the ground, out of breath. I am unable. Don't you see me? He cried, lifting his eyes toward the burning heavens. I am unable. Why do you choose me? I cannot endure. And as he cried out, he saw a black mass on the sand before him. The goat disemboweled, its legs in the air. He remembered how he had leaned over and seen his own face in the leaden eyes. I am the goat, he murmured. God placed him along my path to show me who I am and where I am heading. Suddenly he began to weep. I don't want, he murmured. I don't want to be alone. Help me. And then, while he was bowed over and weeping, a pleasant breeze blew. The stench of the tar and the carcass disappeared, and a sweet perfume pervaded the world. The eremite heard water, bracelets, and laughter jingling in the distance and approaching. His eyelids, armpits, and throat felt refreshed. He lifted his eyes. On a stone in front of him, a snake with the eyes and breasts of a woman was licking its lips and regarding him. The eremite stepped back, terrified. Was this a snake, a woman, or a cunning demon of the desert? Such a serpent had wrapped itself around the forbidden tree of paradise, and seduced the first man and woman to unite and give birth to sin. He heard laughter and the sweet wheedling voice of a woman. I felt sorry for you, son of Mary. You cried, I don't want to be alone. Help me. I pitied you and came. What can I do for you? I don't want you. I didn't call you. Who are you? Your soul. My soul? Jesus exclaimed, and he closed his eyes, horrified. Yes, your soul. You are afraid of being alone. Your great-grandfather Abraham had the same fear. He too shouted for help, his flesh and soul united. The woman emerged from his rib to keep him company. I don't want you. Don't want you. I remember the apple you fed to Adam. I remember the angel with the scimitar. You remember, and that's why you're in pain, and you cry out and cannot find your way. I shall show it to you. Give me your hand. Don't look back. Don't recall anything. See how my breasts take the lead. Follow them, my spouse. They know the way perfectly. You're going to lead me also to a sweet sin and the inferno. I'm not coming. Mine is another road. The serpent giggled derisively and showed her sharp, poisonous teeth. Do you wish to follow God's tracks? The tracks of the eagle, you worm? You son of the carpenter? Wish to bear the sins of an entire race? Aren't your own sins enough for you? What impudence to think that it's your duty to save the world. She's right. She's right, the eremite thought, trembling. What impudence to wish to save the world. I have a secret to tell you, dear Son of Mary, said the snake in a sweet voice, her eyes sparkling. She slid down from the rock like water and began, richly decorated, to roll toward him. She arrived at his feet, climbed onto his knees, curled herself up, and with a spring reached his thighs, loins, breast, and finally leaned against his shoulder. The eremite, despite himself, inclined his head to hear her. The snake licked Jesus' ear with her tongue. Her voice was seductive and far away. It seemed to be coming from Galilee, from the edge of Lake Gennesaret. It's Magdalene. It's Magdalene. It's Magdalene. What? Said Jesus, shuddering. What about Magdalene? It's Magdalene you must save, the snake hissed imperatively. Not the earth. Forget about the earth. It's her. Magdalene you must save. Jesus tried to shake the serpent away from his head, but she thrust herself forward and vibrated her tongue in his ear. Her body is beautiful, cool, and accomplished. All nations have passed over her, but it has been written in God's hand since your childhood that she is for you. Take her. God created man and woman to match, like the key and the lock. Open her. Your children sit huddled together and numb inside her, waiting for you to blow away their numbness so that they may rise and come out to walk in the sun. Do you hear what I'm telling you? Lift your eyes, give me some sign, just nod your head, my darling, and this very hour I shall bring you on a fresh bed. Your wife. My wife? Your wife. Look how God married the whore Jerusalem. The nations passed over her, but he married her to save her. Look how the prophet Hosea married the whore Gomer, daughter of Debalium. In the same way, God commands you to sleep with Mary Magdalene, your wife, to have children, and save her. The serpent had now pressed its hard, cool, round breast against Jesus' own, and was sliding slowly tortuously wrapping itself around him. Jesus grew pale, closed his eyes, saw Magdalene's firm, high-rumped body wriggling along the shores of Lake Gennesaret, saw her gaze towards the river Jordan and sigh. She extended her hand. She was seeking him, and her bosom was filled with children, his own. He had only to twitch the corner of his eye to give a sign, and all at once, what happiness! How his life would change, sweeten, become more human. This was the way, this. He would return to Nazareth, to his mother's house, would become reconciled with his brothers. It was nothing but youthful folly, madness to want to save the world and die for mankind. But thanks to Magdalene, God bless her, he would be cured. He would return to his workshop, take up once more his old beloved craft, once more make plows, cradles, and throws. He would have children and become a human being, the master of a household. The peasants would respect him and stand up when he passed. He would work the whole week long, and on Saturday go to the synagogue in the clean garments woven for him of linen and silk by his wife Magdalene, with his expensive kerchief over his head, his golden wedding ring on his finger. And he would have his stall with the elders, would sit and listen peacefully and indifferently, while the seething, half-insane scribes and Pharisees sweated and shivered to interpret the Holy Scriptures. He would snigger and look at them with sympathy. Where would they ever end up, these theologians? He was interpreting Holy Scripture quietly and surely by taking a wife, having children by constructing plows, cradles, and throws. He opened his eyes and saw the desert. Where had the day gone? The sun was once more inclining toward the horizon. The serpent, her breast glued to his own, was waiting. She hissed tranquilly, seductively, and a tender, plaintive lullaby flowed into the evening air. The entire desert rocked and lullabied like a mother. "I'm waiting. I'm waiting," the snake hissed solaciously. "Night has overtaken us. I'm cold. Decide. Nod to me, and the doors of paradise will be opened to you. Decide, my darling. Magdalene is waiting." The eremite felt paralyzed with fear. As he was about to open his mouth to say yes, he felt someone above looking down on him. Terrified, he lifted his head and saw two eyes in the air, two eyes only, as black as night, and two white eyebrows, which were moving and signaling to him. "No, no, no!" Jesus' heart contracted. He looked up again beseechingly, as if he wished to scream. "Leave me alone." "Give me permission. Do not be angry." But the eyes had grown ferocious, and the eyebrows vibrated threateningly. "No, no, no!" Jesus then shouted, and two large tears rolled from his eyes. All at once the serpent writhed, unglued herself from him, and with a muffled roar exploded. The air was glutted with the stench. Jesus fell on his face. His mouth, nostrils, and eyes filled with sand. His mind was blank. Forgetting his hunger and thirst, he wept as though his wife and all his children had died, as though his whole life had been ruined. "Lord, Lord," he murmured, biting the sand, "Father, have you no mercy? Your will be done." How many times have I said this to you until now? How many times shall I say it in the future? All my life I shall quiver, resist, and say it. Your will be done. In this way, murmuring and swallowing the sand, he felt asleep. And as the eyes of his body closed, those of his soul opened, and he saw the spectre of the serpent as thick as the body of a man, and extending in length from one end of the night to the other. She was stretched out on the sand with her wide, bright red mouth opened at his side. Opposite his mouth hopped an ornate, trembling partridge, struggling in vain to open its wings and escape. It staggered forward, uttering small, weak cries, its feathers raised out of fear. The motionless serpent kept her eyes glued on it, her mouth opened. She was in no hurry, for she was sure of her prey. The partridge advanced little by little directly toward the open mouth, stumbling on its crooked legs. Jesus stood still and watched, trembling like the partridge. At daybreak, the bird had at last reached the gaping mouth. It quivered for a moment, glanced quickly around as though seeking aid, then suddenly stretched forth its neck and entered head first, feet together. The mouth closed. Jesus was able to see the partridge, a ball of feathers and meat and ruby-colored feet, descend little by little toward the dragon's belly. He jumped up, terrified. The desert was a mass of swelling, rose-colored waves. The sun was rising. "It is God," he murmured, trembling. "And the partridge is—" His voice broke. He did not have the strength to complete his reflection. But inside himself he thought, "Man's soul. The partridge is man's soul." He remained plunged in this reflection for hours. The sun came up, set the sand on fire. It pierced Jesus' skull, went inside him, and parched his mind, throat, and breast. His entrails were suspended like bunches of leftover grapes after the autumn vintage. His tongue had stuck to his palate. His skin was peeling off, his bones emerging, and his fingertips had turned completely blue. Time within him had become as small as a heartbeat, as large as death. He was no longer hungry or thirsty. He no longer desired children and a wife. His whole soul had squeezed into his eyes. He saw. That was all. He saw. But at precisely noon, his sight grew dim. The world vanished, and a gigantic moth gaped somewhere in front of him. Its lower jaw, the earth; its upper jaw, the skies. Trembling, he dragged himself slowly forward toward the opened mouth. His neck stretched forward. The days and nights went by like flashes of white and black lightning. One midnight a lion came and stood in front of him, proudly shaking its mane. Its voice was like a man's. "Welcome to my lair, victorious, ecstatic. I salute the man who conquered the minor virtues, the small joys and happiness. We don't like what's easy and sure. Our sights are on difficult things. Magdalene isn't a big enough wife for us. We wish to marry the entire earth. Bridegroom, the bride has sighed. The lamps of the heavens are lighted. The guests have arrived. Let us go. Who are you? Yourself. The hungry lion inside your heart and loins that at night prowls around the sheepfolds, the kingdoms of this world, and weighs whether or not to jump in and eat. I rush from Babylon to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Alexandria, from Alexandria to Rome, shouting, I am hungry. Everything is mine. At daybreak, I re-enter your breast and shrink. The terrifying lion becomes a lamb. I play at being the humble ascetic who desires nothing, who seems able to live on a grain of wheat, a sip of water, and on a naive, accommodating God whom he tries to flatter with the name of Father. But secretly, in my heart, I am ashamed. I grow fierce and yearn for nightfall, when I can throw off my sheepskin and begin once more to roar, roam the night, and stamp my 4 feet down on Babylon, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Rome. I don't know who you are. I never desired the kingdom of this world. The kingdom of heaven is sufficient for me. It is not. You deceive yourself, friend. It is not sufficient for you. You don't dare gaze within yourself, deep within your loins and heart, to find me. Why do you look askance and think ill of me? Do you believe I am temptation, an emissary of the sly one, come to mislead you? You brainless hermit, what strength can external temptation have? The fortress is taken only from within. I am the deepest voice of your deepest self. I am the lion within you. You have wrapped yourself in the skin of a lamb to encourage men to approach you, so that you can devour them. Remember, when you were a small child, a Chaldean sorceress looked at your palm. I see many stars, she said, many crosses. You shall become king. Why do you pretend to forget? You remember it day and night. Rise, son of David, and enter your kingdom. Jesus listened with bowed head. Little by little, he recognized the voice. Little by little, he recalled having heard it sometimes in his dreams, and once, when he was a child, and Judas had thrashed him, and one other time, when he had left his house, and roamed the fields for days and nights, pinched with hunger, then returned shamefully home to be greeted with hoots by his brothers, lame Simon and pious Jacob, who were standing in the doorway. Then, truly, he had heard the lion roar inside him. And only the other day, when he carried the cross to the zealot's crucifixion and passed before the stormy crowd, everyone looking at him with disgust and moving out of his path, the lion had again jumped up within him, and with such force that he was thrown down. And now, in this forsaken midnight, look, the bellowing lion inside him had come out and stood before him. It rubbed itself against him, vanished and reappeared, as though going in and out of him, and playfully tapped him with its tail. Jesus felt his heart grow more and more ferocious. The lion is really right, he thought. I've had enough of all of this. I'm fed up with being hungry and wanting to play at humility, with offering the other cheek only to get it slapped. I'm tired of flattering this man-eating God with the name of Father in order to cajole him to be more gentle. Tired of hearing my brothers curse me, my mother weep, men laugh when I go by, sick of going barefooted, of not being able to buy the honey, wine, and women I see when I pass the market, and of finding courage only in my sleep to have God bring them to me, so that I can taste and embrace the empty air. I'm sick of it all. I shall rise, gird myself with the ancestral sword. Am I not the son of David? And enter my kingdom. The lion is right. Enough of ideas and clouds and kingdoms of heaven, stones and soil and flesh. That is my kingdom. He rose. Somewhere he found the strength to jump up and gird himself. Gird himself interminably with an invisible sword, bellowing like a lion. He was ready. "Forward!" he cried. He turned, but the lion had disappeared. He heard pulsating laughter above him, and a voice. "Look!" A flash of lightning knifed through the night and stood fixed, motionless. Under it were cities with walls and towers, houses, roads, squares, people, and all around plains, mountains, sea. Babylon was to the right, Jerusalem and Alexandria to the left, and across the sea was Rome. Once more he heard the voice. "Look!" Jesus raised his eyes. A yellow-winged angel dropped headfirst from the sky. Lamentations were heard. In the four kingdoms, the people lifted their arms to heaven, but their hands fell off, gnawed away by leprosy. They parted their lips to cry help, and their lips fell, devoured by leprosy. The streets filled with hands and noses and mouths. And while Jesus cried with upraised arms, "Mercy, Lord, have pity on mankind," a second angel, dapple-winged, with bells around his feet and neck, fell head-first from heaven. All at once, laughter and guffawing broke out over the entire earth. Struck down by madness, the lepers were running helter-skelter. Whatever remained of their bodies had burst into peals of laughter. Trembling, Jesus blocked his ears so that he would not hear. And then a third angel, red-winged, fell like a meteor from the sky. 4 fountains of fire rose up, 4 columns of smoke, and the stars were extinguished for want of air. A light breeze blew, scattering the fumes. Jesus looked. The 4 kingdoms had become 4 handfuls of ashes. The voice sounded once more. "These, wretch, are the kingdoms of this world which you are setting out to possess, and those are my 3 beloved angels, leprosy, madness, and fire. The day of the Lord has come, my day, mine." With this last clap of thunder, the lightning dispersed. The dawn found Jesus with his face plunged in the sand. During the night he must have rolled off his stone and wept, for his eyes were swollen and smarting. He looked around him. Could this endless sand be his soul? The desert was shifting, coming to life. He heard shrill cries, mocking laughter, weeping. Small animals resembling rabbits, squirrels, and weasels, all with ruby red eyes, were hopping toward him. "It is madness," he thought. "Madness come to devour me." He cried out, and the animals dispersed. An archangel, with the half-moon suspended from his neck, and a joyous star between his eyebrows, towered up before him and unfurled his green wings. Jesus shaded his eyes against the dazzling light. "Archangel," he whispered. The archangel closed his wings and smiled. "Don't you recognize me?" he said. "Don't you remember me?" "No, no, who are you? Go farther away, Archangel, you're blinding me." "Do you remember when you were a small child still unable to walk? You clung to the door of your house and your mother's clothes so that you would not fall, and shouted within yourself, shouted loudly, 'God, make me God! God, make me God! God, make me God!' Don't remind me of that shameless blasphemy. I remember it. I am that inner voice. I shouted then. I shout still. But you're afraid and pretend not to hear. Now, however, you are going to listen to me, like it or not. The hour has come. I chose you before you were born. You out of the whole of mankind. I work and gleam within you, prevent you from falling into the minor virtues, the small pleasures, into happiness. Behold how just now, when woman came into the desert where I brought you, I banished her. The kingdoms came, and I banished them. I did. I, not you. I am reserving you for a destiny much more important, much more difficult." "More important? More difficult?" "What did you long for when you were a child? To become God. That is what you shall become." "I? I?" "Don't shrink back. Don't moan. That is what you shall become. What you have already become. What words do you think the wild dove threw over you at the Jordan?" Tell me. Tell me." "You are my son, my only son." That was the message brought you by the wild dove. But it was not a wild dove. It was an archangel Gabriel. I salute you, therefore, son, only Son of God. 2 wings beat within Jesus' breast. He felt a large, rebellious morning star burning between his eyebrows. A cry rose up within him. "I am not a man, not an angel, not your slave, Adonai. I am your son. I shall sit on your throne to judge the living and the dead. In my right hand I shall hold a sphere, the world, and play with it. Make room for me to sit down." He heard peals of laughter in the air. Jesus gave a start. The angel had vanished. He uttered a piercing cry, "Lucifer!" and fell prone onto the sand. "I shall see you again," said the mocking voice. "We shall meet again one day soon." "Never, never, Satan!" Jesus bellowed, with his face buried in the sand. "Soon," the voice repeated. "At this Passover, miserable wretch." Jesus began to wail. His tears fell in warm drops on the sand, washing, rinsing, purifying his soul. Toward evening, a cool breeze blew. The sun became gentle and colored the distant mountains pink. And then Jesus heard a merciful command, and an invisible hand touched his shoulder. "Stand up. The day of the Lord is here. Run and carry the message to men. I am coming."